Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi barakatuh, and welcome to another episode in the series The Cross Questioned, where we investigate verse by verse, event by event of that fateful weekend of the crucifixion, or the Easter weekend as Christians call it. And in this series, it is our job to look in the text written by the Christians, which is the New Testament, and specifically the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and to see whether the text in fact says that Jesus himself was crucified on that cross, whether Jesus himself died on that cross, and whether Jesus himself was raised from the dead. If the text is not trustworthy and reliable, then the whole of Christianity falls apart. And we have looked step by step at all the issues relating to the crucifixion scene, the resurrection, and the burial scene. And we are continuing with that investigation. Well, last episode, we looked at where Jesus was crucified, how he was buried, and what actually happened that period of time when he was allegedly put in the grave. And so we are now moving on to the theory that is given by the Christian text itself on what actually happened when this body that was in this grave, in this tomb, what happened to it while it was there. What does the text say? Not what we think, not what we theorize, not what Christian theology says, but what the text says. Remember, if you have to have someone explain to you what the text says, then your book is not very trustworthy. You should be able to read simply what the text says, and the text should explain itself, like we have when we read the Quran. So let's move on with this issue of the posting of the gods outside of the tomb where the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, is allegedly buried, where we know he wasn't, but allegedly from the New Testament. In the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 27, we have the story of what actually happened, or Matthew 27 is where we are looking at the text. Now, Matthew is the only one who talks about the very day of the Passover when the chief priests and Pharisees realized that perhaps the disciples will come and they will steal the body that was put into the tomb. So in Matthew chapter 27, verse 63, we have the Jews only realizing at this time, and the text says, the deceiver said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. So it is strange that when it comes to the story of the crucifixion and the burial and the laying of the body, that the Jews didn't think that it was important to come and investigate the body of Jesus when he was taken off the cross. That they waited a whole day or right through to the morning before they come and ask for someone to put a god, or that night. Why didn't they go check the grave, say we need to check to make sure that he's in fact dead, and then post gods afterwards? So why do they come at this later stage? This also smacks of a later invention, a later scribe adding this in, or a later writer writing this in, and it wasn't part of the original text. So in Matthew chapter 27, it continues in verse 65 by saying, Pilate said to them, do what you want to do, put the gods there to make sure that nothing happens. Just paraphrasing what it actually says. So he sends guards to stand on duty to make sure that nothing happens. Now Pilate must have known that this type of thing would need to be done, or maybe they had pre-planned that this thing was going to happen. And so the body must have already been, if we believe in the theory of the fact that the body doesn't remain in the tomb, it's probably already been removed. Remember we spoke about how the grave was newly made, that it was darkness, there were no lanterns, nobody had investigated the grave scene. It's quite possible that by the time the guards were put on duty to protect the grave, that this body has already been taken away. It's possibility. We're not saying it's like that, but there's a great possibility that this has already happened. When we read Matthew chapter 27, verse 66, it says, and so they went and made the grave or the sepulchre or the tomb protected, or sure, it says. And sealing it with a stone, they set watch over the area. Now it seems hard to believe that the Jews will place so much emphasis on Jesus' alleged saying that he will be dead and after 3 days he will rise again, when his own disciples didn't believe that this was going to happen. They only believed this, remember, that he would rise again on the third day, after it was exposed to them after the post-resurrection, that then they understood what he meant. So if all his disciples, his mother, his brother, his friends, his family, none of them believed it, why would some Jews, the only charge that they had against him was that he claimed to be the Son of God, or God. Why would they believe that he was going to rise again? That's why we believe, and I'm strongly a believer, that this was something that was added in at a much later time by other scribes and other writers to fill in the blanks, as it were. And even after receiving this news, they didn't believe it anyway. When we hear the disciples at the post-resurrection scene, many of them said they did not believe it. Even those ones who saw it, some of the disciples who actually physically saw, according to the text, the risen Jesus, said, and some of them did not believe. So it's very odd for us to believe this piece of scripture. The whole episode looks like as if it was an afterthought by the gospel writer or a further copyist later in the years to come. Nowadays, we believe that much of what we see in the text is actually an addition. There are many, many ways that we can see that the text has been changed over the years. Not only by the fact that it looks like it's a quick afterthought, but also in the style of writing. How we find it in Matthew, especially in Matthew 28, verse 13 onwards, we find that the style of writing is very different. If we remember Matthew chapter 28, verse 2, remember Mark, Luke, John never record this. I mean, John loves to exaggerate things. He loves to make a mountain into Kilimanjaro, let alone a molehill into a mountain. He wants to turn a mountain into Kilimanjaro. And yet he misses out on this divine opportunity, this perfect opportunity to exaggerate, as we see Matthew does. And we can see that Matthew probably also exaggerated this story, or it was again written by a later copyist. Remember Matthew chapter 28, verse 2, when it says, and there was a great earthquake, and the angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled back the stone from the entrance to the door of the tomb. Remember that Matthew likes to talk about all these strange things happening. And what does Matthew chapter 28, verse 13 say? And they said the disciple has come and stolen the body from the tomb. So you can see between the angels descending, between the story and verse 13 where the insinuation is somebody came and stole the body. So in between them we have this passage thrown in between these two ridiculous, outrageous stories given. And so one wonders how come when we see this that none of the other narrators write a similar story. It is intriguing that those people who came to the scene, these women, who came to the scene after the stone had been rolled away, these women, these fragile women as they are tried to be made out in the Bible, when they come to the grave and they see that the stone has been rolled back and this angel descends as is being given and the earth shakes, it says that the gods shook with fear and they lay on the ground as if they were dead. But what were the women doing? The women were fine. They just walked in, like maybe they were made of a different steel back in those days. Maybe the women were tougher than the men and the men were weaklings. But it's very doubtful that that is the case because the men were the fighters and women were basically treated like property. Women were treated as if they were like animals in those days. And so it is very doubtful that these guards on duty protecting the tomb as they shook with fear and fell to the ground and pretended to be dead, as the text said, and the women stand there undisturbed as if nothing had happened and continued having conversations. So the text, the way it is written, we can see that this is probably more than likely an influence of a later scribe or a later copyist, and it's a very far-fetched explanation of the one that we are unable to accept as modern-day scholars when we look at it. If Jesus did rise in the flesh, he should have walked out of that tomb. The stone doesn't need to be rolled away by an angel. If we believe that he is absolute God, as the Christians would say, absolute God, absolute Son of God, whatever, he would have been able to look and with a word, as the Bible says, God created with a word. Simply the word, who is Jesus according to Christianity, could have said to the stone, move. He had power over stones to tell that stone, move, and the stone would have moved. There's no need for an angel to descend from heaven. So this text doesn't make logical sense. It's a fabrication from a later stage in time. Most likely, we find that the stone was probably still sealed. Probably none of this post-grave story ever took place, and that it is an invention, an innovation. And even if it did take place, the body would have been removed long before the guards were put on duty. And as we will see a little bit later, it is extremely unlikely that the guards were even put on duty, and if they did, then they wouldn't have admitted to falling on the ground and trembling with fear and acting like dead. These were Roman soldiers. You could get killed for less as a Roman soldier. You would not admit that this scenario took place. And the big question we should be asking is, who's recording this? Who is observing this? It's not the women that are seeing this, because we're having some mysterious being hovering over and writing this. Well, it's time for us to take a break. When we get back from a break, we'll continue, inshallah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome back from the break. We are continuing with our investigation of the cross question. And before the break, we are talking about the stone that got rolled away. And we said there's no requirement for the stone to be rolled away, because we have seen in the text that according to Christians, that Jesus had power over all things. I mean, he was able to walk through walls. He was able to be in one place and then another place. He had supernatural powers at this time. So there's no need for an angel to come down, roll the stone away, and people to walk into the tomb and see that it was empty. Jesus at any time could have just moved it away. In fact, it is highly unlikely that the stone was ever moved in the first place. There was no need to move the stone. He could have just projected himself through the stone, because that's where we hear the abilities that he has in the post-resurrected body according to Christianity. And there's no need to look at a tomb. For what? He is going to appear to them later. He's going to see them on the streets. He's going to come to the upper room. There's no requirement whatsoever. The story makes no effect on the rest of the dialogue. There's no point in the whole story of the rolling away of the stone even being included. It means absolutely nothing to your salvation if you believe in the crucifixion and the resurrection. It has nothing to do with anything. It is a waste of time. It's a waste of ink. It's a waste of writing, because it just leads to more questions. If you roll away the stone, it creates more questions than Christians are able to answer. Now, the opening of this tomb, as we are speaking about now, if we look in Mark, Luke, and John, they do not report the posting of any centurions or any Roman guards on duty at this sepulchre, at this grave, at this tomb. So Mark, Luke, and John, nothing. It's only Matthew who records this. According to them, when Mary Magdalene and her company arrived at the site, the stone had already been rolled away, and Jesus was not there, and he was neither dead in the grave, or he was neither alive in the grave. So Mark, Luke, and John don't talk about anyone being posted on duty. All they say is that by the time Mary got there, there was no body at the grave. There was no body and no body. It was basically empty. Now, according to Matthew, Jesus disappears from behind a sealed stone. So we see that he didn't have to have the stone pushed out of the way so that he could come out of the grave. He was already gone by the time Matthew gives the narration. So he was able to walk through walls already. He was already able to project out of there. So one has to ask the question, what's the point of moving the stone? I know I'm going on and on about this point, but Matthew is the one who says that guards were posted on duty. You have to ask yourself, dear Christian who is watching, according to Matthew, Jesus has already disappeared from behind the sealed stone. There is no point. There is nothing to the reasoning to have him there. He could not have done this if he was in the flesh, unless he had been whisked away before the arrivals of Matthew's version of the guards on duty, because he calls to the disciples and says, I am in the flesh. A ghost does not have flesh and blood. If he's in the flesh, how does he walk out of the grave? Now, the apologists would like us to believe that he had a transfigured body, a transformed body. We're going to get to this later, where we'll see that that is not possible because it contradicts the other statements, as we'll find later. So let's move ahead in this argument. We have Mary of Magdala and her friends who are with her, the other Marys, the companions that were with her. And this is also more or less the last time we're ever going to hear of woman dealt with in the New Testament having any significance. The Marys. So, who were these women? Where do they come from? What is their story? How do they fit into this equation? What type of women were these that we are told about? The evidence or the information about these women is found in Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3. It says, and the 12 were with a certain woman which had been healed of evil spirits and other infirmities. The woman's name was Mary of Magdala, out of whom 7 demons or 7 devils were cast out, and Joanna. These are the women that are spoken about in Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3. It is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. If you ask 90% of the Christians, unless they've been to biblical school or studied strict theology, even Bible students get this wrong. They say it's Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's not. It's Mary of Magdala, who was possessed with demons, who was possessed with 7 devils and had devils cast out of her. That's the woman that we are talking about that was there, who had been healed of spirits and other infirmities. We don't know what the other infirmities are that are mentioned here. Do they credit these women with sufficient credibility and accept what they're going to say about the rising of Jesus from the dead? This is who they are. Will the rest of those disciples that were with Jesus, his brothers, his family, will they accept what these women are about to give to the disciples and say to the disciples? Will they accept it? I mean, these people were with Jesus all the time, according to what we find in the New Testament. Will the disciples that were friends with these women, that were followed Jesus all around, will they accept these women's words? Remember, this is the New Testament. This is Christianity we're talking about. Let's see what credibility these women have in the eyes of the people around at that time. They have seen, according to the account that we find in the Bible, the risen Jesus. So let's have a look at Luke chapter 24, verse 11. It says, the disciples said, nonsense. That's what they said. That's the words that came out of their mouths. When they came, and these women came, these pillars, these women who were close to Jesus and the disciples, they came to the disciples and said, we've seen the risen Christ. We've seen the risen Lord. He's alive. They said, nonsense, or rubbish, or that is absolute nonsense. Their words seem to be tall tales, as it says in Luke chapter 24, verse 11. And they would not and did not believe them. The actual wording is, and they believed them not. But I'm giving a little bit of explanation to that. The exact words, and they seem to be talking idle tales, and they believed them not. That's how much they believed a woman in those days. Now, if they were smart enough, they must have realized from their own walking and talking and being with Jesus that he was a person who said he would come to life again. He prophesied it. Yet when the woman told them, they would not believe him. They must have reasoned that these women were insane, that maybe when they went to put the spices and anoint his body, that maybe they inhaled too many of those spices and those things, and so they were delusional. And it's interesting after this episode that these women, when they give their story, are never heard of again. They disappear into oblivion, not ever heard of again. That's how important a woman is in Christianity. These were the women that were supposedly looking after and caring for the disciples and Jesus, and they disappear. Could they have gone with their master so far and then be written out of the history books and said to be, don't listen to them, they are speaking nonsense? In fact, that's what we hear in all the narrations. All the narrations speak of women in this way. They didn't believe the woman. They said they're talking nonsense. They were not prepared to even listen to the words that were given to them. So we have to understand that the writers, and this is also very clever of the writers, they call all the women by Mary. Most of the women are Mary, Mary, or Mary. There's 3 Marys that are spoken about, purposely to get you confused. The Christians are confused on which Mary was there. Christians are confused which Mary was at the cross. Christians are confused at which Mary came to witness the resurrection. How much more do you think that non-Christians are going to be when they read the text? It's done like this deliberately, so that you will believe it's the same Mary, or Miriam, may Allah be pleased with her, that we find in Islam. Be cautious, brothers. Be cautious, sisters. When the Christian speaks to you and he gives you these texts and he starts to talk about Miriam, 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 ask him, which Miriam are you talking about? Is it the same Miriam that we have in the Quran? Or is it one of those Marys that you yourself don't even know about? That you're not sure which Mary it is talking about? We have to be cautious, brothers and sisters that are listening, that we are after the right information, the right truth. Do not be deceived by the Christian missionaries and the evangelists. They are master manipulators. They themselves have very little knowledge of their own text. They follow doctrine over the Bible. Today we are living in a society of spirit-filled Christians. They say you have to be spirit-filled. They're not even reading their Bible anymore. They're taking direct information from the ether, and the ether is giving them information. Very dangerous times we live in. Well, this is all the time we have, so make sure you join us again next episode as we look deeper into the cross question. So from me, Areeb Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.